name's Bill Bengston. I'm a professor of sociology at St. Joseph's College on Long Island. My day job is a conventional sociologist. I teach sociology, a variety of courses, research methods, statistics, things of that sort. And I do conventional sociological work. I've done conventional sociological work and still do in criminology, the sociology of religion, a couple of different areas. And that's my day job. And I investigate, or I began to investigate anomalous healing on the side. When I was watching a healer do his healings and learning from him on how to reproduce the technique, one of the things that I wanted to do for him was to have an absolute ironclad test. If you deal with people, there's always a chance that it might have been a coincidence. So people spontaneously remiss. If they get sick, sick people get better, and you don't have a whole lot of variables which are controlled. And so if you watch a few healings on people, if you watch dozens of healings on people, they're fascinating, but they're just anecdotes. And you never know, with some exceptions perhaps, you never know whether it would have happened anyway. So the learning curve is very, it's not a great learning curve if you're dealing with people. You're never going to understand the underlying principles because you can't control the environment. So I have a sick person, then I have a well person, and with or without anomalous healing, or with or without someone doing laying on of hands, sick people get better. And so a skeptic on the outside is always going to look at that and say, it was a coincidence, the person was going to get better anyway. I mean, I've seen some things that don't get better. I've seen, for example, gangrene fixed. And that has no known spontaneous remission, but there are very few things that have no spontaneous remissions at all. And I was particularly struck by this guy's incredible ability to heal cancer. He had difficulty with benign tumors, but he didn't have difficulty with cancer. And virtually any type of cancer would respond almost immediately to his treatments. And so as I watched him do hundreds and hundreds of healings, and I also watched him and I get increasingly frustrated at the rejection people felt. Because skeptics would say it was a coincidence. The people who were sick and got better, some actually resented him for it. It kind of ruined his world, or ruined their world, because the kinds of things that were happening to them were completely unexplainable. And the amount of rejection that came to this guy and that I witnessed was extraordinary. People, for the most part, don't want to see the kinds of things that I saw. And so what I thought that we had really plateaued in terms of what we could learn from this, and we had to take this stuff into the laboratory. And so with a great deal of difficulty, Dave Crinsley, a geologist friend of mine, set up a test at Queens College in New York. He was able to get a biology lab and a bunch of mice through the biology department, which would be an absolute airtight test. It was a mammary cancer, which had 100% fatality in 27 days after injection. And so if we could get one mouse to live to day 28, we'd have the world record living mouse, and there'd be no question that this was not a coincidence. I set this up initially for the New York healer, and when the mice came in, after many delays, he backed out. It would be an understatement to say that I threw a fit. We had mice, we had a lab, we had biologists, and we didn't have anybody to do it. And so Dave Crinsley suggested that since I had spent so much time with the healer, that I try it. I thought that was kind of silly. And what we did was we had this cage of mice. I picked them up. They were given to me in a lab. I treated them by putting my hands around the cage for an hour a day and running through these mental techniques that I'd been taught. I expected, if this thing was going to work, that no tumors would grow. And when I saw the tumors starting to grow on the mice, I figured this was a failure. Dave Crinsley said, keep going, we got nothing to lose. I watched the tumors get larger, and then a blackened area appeared on the tumors. The tumors opened up, they ulcerated, became very, very ugly, and then the tumors imploded into themselves, and the mice were fine, and they lived their normal lifespan of 2 years. I was utterly flabbergasted, utterly astonished, and I know what to do. And so obviously, if you're going to do scientific research, the first thing you have to do is repeat it. And so what I did is I said, well, if it's only me, I'm in trouble. And so I wanted to get other people to see if they could reproduce the effect. And so to get back at Crinsley, I made him be a subject. I got a faculty member at Queens College, and I got 2 students from my college, all 4 of whom thought that this was insane. And if you threw me in, it would be 5 that thought it was insane. And we went through a training period which required 6 weeks to learn these techniques. We got more mice. They got their mice. They treated the mice, and the same thing happened. I still didn't believe it. I moved to my college, St. Joseph's College, and I started to train more skeptical volunteers. We got complicated results, but essentially the same thing. I did it again, and so after 4 times, I finally conceded, 4 times in 2 different labs, that something very, very real and something very anomalous is going on, and something that it was exciting. It was very exciting. We found a number of phenomena with the mice that I'm still exploring. Once the mice remissed, they lived their, not only they lived their full lifespan, but if we re-injected them with the cancer wouldn't take. And so the mice not only lived their normal lifespan, but they were immune to the cancer for life. This was a good finding. I'm hoping to parlay that into something like a vaccine to see if I can reproduce the effect without the laying on of hands. In the mammary cancer, we did 4 experiments with small numbers, and I had, I believe, 33 remissions out of 36 mice, something like that, you know, within a couple of mice. We had a couple of failures, and I think I can explain the failures. They were actually failures done by volunteer biology students who were very nervous in the lab. And they felt very uncomfortable in the lab, and they're the only ones that failed. So a couple of biology students in labs were unable to do it. I also gave them a couple of mice to take home to see if they could do it there, and they were successful at home, unsuccessful in the lab. To answer your question, how many experiments, I've now done 6. I've done the 4 with the mammary cancer, and I did 2 with a sarcoma. And I just did those at the University of Connecticut. For that, I was the person who did it. We didn't have an approved protocol at the University of Connecticut, as you know. I ran into a variety of trouble. We had to abort the experiments early because we got busted at the University of Connecticut. At the time of being busted, I think I had 14 more remissions of sarcoma. My goal at UConn was to take the blood of the cured mice and to see if there were any immunological factors which were present, which could be parlayed into a more conventional type of vaccine. As of today, I still haven't been able to get to the blood. And so I need the blood, I need a lab, I need to find out what actually happened internally to the mice. So I've done 6 not full procedures, I did 4 full procedures and 2 experiments at UConn which were aborted suddenly. Well, not too surprisingly, now there's been a number of people trained in how to do this. Interestingly enough, the most common response they have after they're successful in healing the mice is anger at me. Because now the question in their minds is, well, what do I do with this? And where they had a nice, safe, skeptical world, now suddenly they find out they can heal cancer that's never been fixed before. And they ask the exact same question you just did. Will that translate into humans? And they don't like that obligation, or they don't like that feeling. And so you go from being safe and relatively powerless to now confused and not knowing what you're able to do. We've tried a couple of people, nothing systematic, nothing controlled, nothing that I would say would be anywhere as near as rigorous as you'd find in the experimental animals. We've had some success. And so I continue to find that cancer seems to respond very, very quickly. Whatever it is we're doing, cancer works. If you treat a malignant tumor, the malignant tumor responds very, very quickly. If you treat a benign tumor, at least with whatever it is that we do, there's little or no response. And so for reasons that utterly baffle me, we seem to, for lack of a better word, resonate with cancer. Grad at McGill tells me that we're the only ones who have ever healed cancer. I have no idea if that's true. But in terms of experimental animals, we're the only ones who have ever done it. I don't know why that is. And in answer to your question, is it translatable to humans? I suspect so. Humans, however, are more complicated, and you can't control their environment, and they do crazy things to themselves, and they try to poison themselves, and they try to hurt themselves, and they don't take care of themselves. And so, you know, it's certainly not a direct translation. Yeah. We've done other mammals, too, in less controlled studies. And what we've observed is the larger the animal, the slower the remission rate. And I don't know if that has to do with body mass. I don't know if it has to do with metabolic rate. But we've seen an inverse relationship between the healing rate and the body mass. Small animals go quicker than larger animals. So hamsters cure slower than mice, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, I can tell you that non-believers can be trained in a series of techniques to cure cancer. The interesting thing is I've never tested a believer. So I have no idea whether a believer is able to do this. And that sounds silly, but I have no idea whether a believer is able to do this. And frankly, I think that I've had an advantage by dealing with non-believers over people who know and study and such. So if I talk to someone who, for example, knows something about Reiki, then they start relating this to Reiki. If I know someone who's a pranic healer, then they start relating this to their pranic training. And so they take a little of this and a little of that. The advantage of a non-believer is that they come in as a blank slate. And so they come in as a blank slate, and they also think I'm crazy. And so they say, well, I'll prove that you're crazy, and I'll prove that you're crazy by doing exactly what you tell me to do. And at the end of that, when it fails, then I'll be able to tell you you're crazy. And I go, that's a perfect system. So they do exactly what I tell them to do, and then they get real upset when the animals remiss. And so in terms of your question of human potential, they certainly have more potential than they thought. And so that at least speaks to non-believers. Now, I can't think of a single reason why a non-believer would have more or less potential than a believer. I'm saying that it's probably easier to train a non-believer. And I have no empirical evidence that a believer could successfully go through this, or whether or not they'd muck it up by combining various techniques. I also, frankly, don't know what techniques that I learned and teach really do the healing. And this should be another goal of further research. Well, we could talk in terms of theoretical understanding. We could also talk in terms of practical application. In terms of practical application, I've already said my goal is a vaccine. I have no idea really whether this will work, and I'm kind of frustrated right now because I have blood of cured animals, and I have no idea what whether there are any suggestive immunological factors in that blood. So in terms of practical application, obviously, we could take this to different kinds of cancers. I've only done 2 cancers experimentally. We could find out if there's any cancers that you can't affect. We could find out what other types of diseases. And by finding out other types of diseases and other types of cancers, it might throw light on whatever this thing is. So I don't know if it's a healing energy. I really don't know its properties. I could suggest dozens of different kinds of experiments to do, but it's going to take a lab. It's going to take some funding. And I suspect that if I had a lab and funding and a bunch of biologists, that I could make some headway with this. My work at UConn has suggested to me that what I'm doing is not an energy field. It suggests something different. And just very quickly, we've had, whereas everybody else has taken these mice and tried to get them, the experimental mice, to live, and they assume the control mice will die, I have trouble getting the control mice to die. And the control mice in all of our experiments in the different labs, whether it's Connecticut, whether it's in Arizona, whether it's in New York, and a couple places in New York, they all anomalously remiss also, even though we're not directly treating them. And it leads to a kind of preposterous position where we're trying to get some mice to die and some mice to live. And we have trouble getting some of the control mice to die unless we send them away. They have to be sent someplace out of our influence. But I don't think it's a field. What we've discovered also is that you can take the same kind of mouse with the same kind of cancer, and let's say I'm holding a cage of mice right here, and you can put a control mouse or a cage of control mice 100 yards away that have been made from the same batch, and so we're just randomly put into a control group. Those control mice will remiss. Well, I'm treating these mice. But mice placed between me and that distant control will be unaffected. And so I think there's some sort of a resonant bond which is created among like mice, and that the treatment of one is the treatment of all. And so I don't think, theoretically, that this is a field effect. I want to test this, but to date I haven't. It could easily be tested. We could prepare a group of mice of any number that you want and take a couple of them and isolate them and just treat those small number of mice and see if the whole group remisses. My guess right now is that it will, but I don't know. Need to test that. So all I need is a lab, bunch of biologists, and unlimited money. And then I think I could solve it. Given enough time. I mean, these are all... The interesting thing about what we're doing is that in the history of research, there has been questions about whether belief matters, and I think I've pretty well demonstrated that it doesn't, or at the very least that non-belief is fine. There's been questions about whether this stuff is teachable, and I think we've fairly answered that it is teachable. And the biggest problem in all this research has been that the effects aren't reliable. And we can produce remissions on demand. And so since we seem to be, at least the only ones I know of, who can produce these remissions on demand, rather than having this vague thing that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, since we can produce the remissions on demand, we can really design these studies to find out what are the natures, what's the nature of this healing energy, what are the parameters of healing, things of that sort. And so we finally could get the answer, because we do have this reliable effect. And it's kind of fun to teach a non-believer and kind of knock their socks off. It's fun to watch the reaction, even though the most common long-term result is they get mad at me and they don't want to talk to me anymore, because their life was better without me. It really was. It's simpler. I'm astonished at the lack of scientific curiosity out there among allegedly intellectually curious scientists. So biologists who've worked with me, beginning by laughing in my face and saying, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, when they see it, they utter a whole variety of profanities, suggesting that they're surprised. And then they want it repeated, and then I repeat it, and then they go, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I can't explain it. We go to the sources of the mice. We go all search the literature. Nobody's ever seen what we produce. And then you ask, well, would you like to keep going? And they all of them say no. This is too much. And they have safe academic careers, and they're in their own niche doing whatever it is that they're doing. And to get involved with this hocus pocus crap, it has no upside to them. When I was at the University of Connecticut Medical School, I had given a talk in there on my early work in healing to a group of skeptical physicians, cancer researchers, oncologists, and I had defended myself until they finally said, hey, I think you might have something there. They invited me up there. When I was up there, not one person in several months, not a single person in a very large complex of labs, and they knew I was there, not one person talked to me or asked a question. And when I approached several of them to ask if they were interested in investigating this, they all said, if it works, it's the most amazing thing they've ever seen, and no, I'm not interested in working with you. They didn't look at the results. They didn't ask questions. There was no dialogue. There was no interest whatsoever. They had tunnel vision. They were working on their piece of research, and they were not concerned about spreading into anything that was outside their narrow band of expertise. And so my biggest frustration has been the lack of scientific curiosity in the face of evidence. So we're not asking to investigate something for which there's no evidence. I'm showing them a cancer cure, and they go, that's astonishing to me. It's actually sad, because, I mean, I think you should be intellectually playful. I think it's personally confusing to them, and I think that it's sad that they're not open, This is one of the reasons I like coming to this group, the Society for Scientific Exploration, because they come from all sorts of fields. So there's physicians here, and there's biologists here, and there's psychologists here, and you know, they come from all kinds of professions, but they're all intellectually alive. Doesn't mean they're not skeptical about new stuff, but they're intellectually alive. And I find that a whole lot of fun. It's fun to be here. It's kind of a shock when you go back to the real world and you realize that people really are in their own little box, in their own little world, doing their own little thing. And that they're not, they lose the sense of playfulness.